Welcome. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. And
Amen.
here we are, where we are at this point. And it's interesting. Okay, I had my place. Where are we? There. I believe that's where we are. Just want to make all right. Yes. So we at this point have the fate of the Israelites. Now we're in the process of declaring that fate, that God is declaring that fate, and we're going to realize that they aren't going to die all at once, but they are going to die in the course of 40 years of wandering in the desert, and a whole new generation is going to be the one to enter the land of Canaan. We also learned that the tribe of Levi is actually excluded from this edict, that they are not going to die out in so quickly. So we are going to go on with this. Uvnechem, there we go, and your children, Iyu ro'im v'midbar. So it could mean will pasture in this desert, in this wilderness. In other words, they're going to wander around arba'im shana for 40 years. V'nasu etznutechem. They will bear your waywardness. Azona is the Hebrew word, the biblical word for someone for a prostitute. That's because it has to do with going away from what is considered proper behavior. So that's the basis of this word. Ad tom, until the completion, the end. Pigrechem bamidbar, until the end of literally means your corpses in the wilderness. In other words, until you're finished dying out. Pretty tough stuff. So, Arba'im shana, 40 years. Lo meit echad mehem pachod miben shishim. So you now know that not one of them died any younger than 60 years old, because the youngest that were included in this group were 20 years old, and so 20 plus 40 is 60. A lot of them probably were older than that, and so they would have died older than 60 years old. That was the youngest. L'chach nigzar arba'im shana, arba'im. And this is why it was 40 years, kedei sheyihiyu otam shel bnei Esrim, in order that those of them who were 20 years old, magi'in l'chlal shishim, so that those 20-year-old ones would also reach the age of 60 years. V'shana rishona, and as to the first year, haita bichlal, so that was included in the counting. So when he means the first year, he is talking about the year from which they came out of Egypt, because it was a year before they had this incident of Shlach Lacha. V'af al pi shekadma l'shiluach hameraglim, and even though that year preceded the sending out of the spies, the fi Misha asu et ha'egel. This actually is going to answer the question of why the Levites weren't included. Okay, but because from the moment that they made the golden calf, alta gzera zo b'machshava, this particular edict already came to mind. In other words, God could have, in fact, at that moment, condemned them all to wandering 40 years, in other words, dying out. So it already was in place there. Ella shehimtin lahem, but he waited for them ad shetimale Seit until in other words, what this is saying is that they were, the burden of guilt would be filled. So, in other words, God was being patient. As it were, God is forbearing and kind and patient. And so there's actually, in other places, there's statements as to how this sort of all works out. So that the first time you sin, God may be patient. And in fact, depending, of course, on the level of sin and all this kind of stuff. But at a certain point, the burden becomes so heavy that it all spills out and the consequences now follow. Vezehu shenemar, and this is what is referred to in Exodus 32, where it says, this is where God, after the golden calf, incident of the golden calf, and God forgives the Israelites at that point, after Moses pleads with him. God says to him, Uvayom Pokdi, and God says to Moses, on the day that I hold them to account, or the day when I hold to account, I will also, the implication being that at that point, the sin of the golden calf also counts, is added to whatever sin they did. So, Uvayom Pokti B'Meraglim, so that's referring to when I hold them to account for the sin they committed regarding the spies. Ufakadati alehem chatatam. So the whole sentence is Uvayom Pokti Ufakadati alehem chatatam. So in other words, the day he holds them to account refers to the day of the time when they sent out the spies and reacted the way they did. And then it says, I will visit upon them their sin, meaning the one of the golden calf. In other words, that's when they're going to have to pay the consequences of that. For Afkan Ne'emar, and here too it's stated, Tis'u et avonotechem, you will bear, understood, the guilt of your iniquities. So it says avonotechem, right? Which means it's plural. It's plural. Velo avonchem. It doesn't say your iniquity. It says your iniquities. Shte avonot. In other words, referring to two iniquities. Shel Egel, the one where they worship the golden calf. Veshel Tluna, and the one where they were muttering against God. V'chashav lahem b'minyan chayehem. Okay, and he calculates for them in other words, it was calculated in the number of their lives, the number of years of their lives, miktzat shana. So even though that happened 40 days after they came out of Egypt, all right, or 49 days after Egypt, 50 days after they came out of Egypt, they received the 10 Commandments. And then 40 days after that, remember, they then worshiped the golden calf. And that's interesting because if I'm not mistaken, it's another 40 days as I recollect. So there we have that. So he says, but even though that's part of a year, Keshana Kehula, it's like an entire year. Ukeshenichnasu lishnat shishim, and so when they became 60 years old, Metu Otam Shomnei Esrim, the ones who were 20 years old died. So there's some very significant issues that are going on here about divine punishment and divine justice and patience, etc. So we already have, you understand, the idea of a suspended sentence. So sometimes they compare, or they use the patriarchs to symbolize mercy. So Abraham symbolizes compassion. Isaac represents judgment. And Jacob then represents a combination of the two. And if you ask yourself, what's the combination of mercy and justice. The combination is suspended sentence. And that's what we have here. So that because the suspended sentence allows you then to do tshuva, and then you don't even have to pay for the initial infraction. So, v'nasu etznutechem, and they shall bear your waywardness. And he says here to look at the Aramaic translation at Onkelos, to ketagumo v'yikablun yat choveichon. And in what it means, I think what it means here is they will pay out, they will accept, they will receive, something like that, your guilt, what you owe. So, in other words, the young people who are going to have to wander around for those 40 years, but aren't going to die off, the fact that they still have to wander off for those 40 years, in some ways is also carrying a responsibility there. So, ad tom, until your generation passes. B'mispar, and here's another combination, right? B'mispar hayamim asher tartim, according to the number of days which you spied out et haaretz, the land, arba'im yom, 40 days, yom l'shana, a day for a year.
Here's what I found.
Sorry. Yom l'shana, a day for a year. Tisu et avonotechem, you shall bear your iniquity, arba'im shana, for 40 years. V'yadatem et tnuati, and you will understand, you will experience what it was to remove me. In other words, to act in this faithless way. Take a look at the Rashi. So it's tnuati. It is an interesting expression. The Hebrew here isn't simple at all. So he explains it tnuati. Shehani otam et levachem, that you removed your hearts me'acharai, from following me. Tnu'ah, this word tnu'ah, lashon hasara, has the connotation of removal. And he gives an example in Numbers 30, ki hini aviha ota. So this is referring to that section in Numbers, which talks about the fact that a father or a husband can remove the burden of an oath on his daughter or his wife. And the answer is that she will be forgiven. It says for making an oath that she was unable to fulfill. And the reason being because her father, in the case of the daughter, has removed it. Okay. Another way to translate that is that her father has prevented her. One moment. All right. Let me just pause. I'm going to stop the share for a second and pause the. All right, great. So let's keep going. Here we are. Ani Hashem dibarti, I Hashem have spoken. Im lo zot e'seh, again, this is now in a way, if it's by way of an oath, swearing, vowing, making a vow. Im lo zot e'seh, if I don't perform this, l'chol ha'edah hara'ah azot, to this entire wicked community, hano'adim alai, who have gathered against me. Bamidbar hazeh, in this wilderness, yitamu, they will come to an end, v'sham yamutu, and there they will die. You can see why the ninth day of Av is the commemoration of this particular incident. And when I said that the book of Numbers now from this point on has examples of tragic circumstances, you understand that I'm not pulling any punches here. So let's take a look at Rashi, if there is. No. All right, we got one more to go.
That ding is very
so
loud.
sorry. I am so sorry. Okay, I'm going to put on, 1 second. I'm going to see what I can do. Thanks, Lisa. I'm trying to, there we go. All right. I have it on Do Not Disturb, so hopefully it's not going to happen again. Lamed Hey. We did that. Lamed Vav. Anashim asher shalach Moshe. So here we go. And the people whom Moses had sent, latur et haaretz, to spy out the land, vayashuvu vayalinu alav, and they returned and murmured against him at kol ha'ida. So the way we would have to understand this is as a hifil, meaning, and they caused the entire community to murmur against him, lahotzi diba haaretz, by coming out with evil reports regarding the land. Vayashuv, his Rashi, Vayashuvu vayalinu alav, right? They came and they caused to murmur against him. Ukesheshavu mitur haaretz, and when they returned from spying out the land, hirimu alav et kol ha'edah, they caused the entire community to, hirimu has to do with the idea of, shouting out and storming, you might almost say, storming against him. Behotzaat diba otam anashim. So when those people, otam anashim, when those people started speaking ill in this way, and I'm thinking of whether or not that could also refer to the entire community, but I'll have to think about that. It could be ambiguous. Okay. Vayamutu, they died. Here we go. Kol hotzaat diba. Any time it mentions this expression of hotzaat diba, right? Bearing evil reports. Lashon chinuch Devarim. Okay, so it looks like this is saying that it is preparing words, okay, shemalkichim leshonam la'adam. So they take their tongues and express, I imagine is what it's saying, to a person, ledaber bo, to speak against it. Kamo, and here we go, doviv. Okay, so here the word dovev svatai means who makes my lips move, right? Dovev svatai yishanim. So this means my lips speak yishanim, old, ancient words, something to that effect. Vayishne letova. So there are times when you can speak for good, v'yishne l'ra'ah, and there are times when you can inform for evil. L'chach ne'emar, and for this reason it says, ne'emar kan, it says here, motzi'ei dibat ha'aretz ra'ah. So in other words, to come out with a report about the land that was evil. So the word diba alone doesn't mean, what Rashi's trying to tell us, doesn't necessarily mean evil, but it does have this sense of bringing a report of some kind, of providing information of some kind. Sheyesh diba shehi tova, because there are cases when diba, this bringing of information, is actually good. And that's dovev siftei yeshanim. That particular expression refers to expressing something good and informative in that way. Diba takes the word diba. Oh, okay. This certainly looks like a French parler belas. So it means a statement, an expression, something like that, speaking. Geret in gereda. Okay. Let me see if I can read this. Geschwätzt, something like that. I'm not familiar with this particular word here, but aret is a statement, something to say, means to speak. Let's go here. Okay. Vayamutu hanashim motzi'ei dibat haaretz ra'ah. So the people died, those who had expressed, had spoken wickedly about the land, b'magefa, in a plague, lifnei Hashem, before the Lord. So they're the ones who died instantly, as opposed to everyone else. Let's see, yeah, b'magefa lifnei Hashem, in a plague before Hashem, ba'ota mita, in that kind of death, the type of death, hahaguna lahem, which was appropriate for them. Mina keneged midah, in other words, measure for measure. Hem chatu belashon, they sinned through their tongues. Venishtarvev leshonam ad tiburam. So this is pretty explicit and descriptive. In other words, that their tongues went back up until their navels. The tolaim yotzim milshonam, and worms. I'm sorry to share this with you. It's pretty explicit. Tolaim are worms. Yotzim milshonam, come out of their tongues. Uvain letoch tiburam, and they enter into their navels. And for this reason, it says b'magefa. So we have to look at this, at the word. So it says b'magefa, is the point that Rashi is making. So in other words, the plague, not a plague, but the plague. So without points here, of course, it looks exactly the same, but that's what he's saying here. Velo b'magefa. It doesn't say in a plague. Vezehu lifnei Hashem. In other words, and this is what is referred to when it says before Hashem. In other words, the ota haruya lahem, the one which they deserved, essentially, is what this is saying. Al pi midotav shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. This has to do with divine justice, right? This is the quality of divine justice, of the Holy One, blessed be He. Shehu modeh midah keneged midah, because what He does is He measures a measure for measure. So we have, as you know, that when we started the whole Torah study and we talked about Adonai Elohim, these two words, that Adonai, the word we use for Adonai, has to do with compassion. We discussed the fact that, interesting enough, the Torah starts with Bereshit bara Elohim, right? It doesn't say Bereshit bara Hashem. In the beginning, God created, and it doesn't say in the beginning, Hashem created. And later on, it says Adonai Elohim. And there was a beautiful interpretation that said initially and in principle, the world would have been created strictly by divine justice. And that God realized that the world would not endure if that were the case. And of course, remember the scales in the representation of justice, the scales. So if you do things that are wicked, you will be paid back in kind. And that's the notion of justice. So, any thoughts we had about God being a sugar daddy in the sky kind of get messed up with this particular interpretation that we have here. But the idea of accountability, that we have accountability in our lives, and that whatever we do, by the way, of course, immediately has far more significance if you realize that if you do well, and if you try to act in a righteous way, no matter what, ultimately that you're going to be rewarded for it. And not to say that you're doing it for the sake of a reward, but nevertheless that you know that there is ultimately divine justice. And if you perform wicked acts, they are going to have their consequences as well. And the truth, of course, is that if this was a universally accepted principle, and if people really, really internalized this idea, we wouldn't be reading, I guess the news might be a lot different than the kind of news that we're reading these days. And I'm going to stop here. And if any of you would like to share something for the record, please feel free to contribute. So I'm going to stop the share.
Yeah, I have something to say, Rabbi.
Yes.
I'm very ignorant. I know God will forgive me, I hope, but I am so ignorant. When the tribes were, when God says a year for 40, the spies were there for 40 days, and I'm going to give a year for each day.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, but who buried the tribes, Simon and Dan and so forth? Who buried them, and where were they buried?
So what would happen, remember, they didn't all die in one large group at a time, okay? So there would have been people to take care of them in the wilderness.
Well,
They would have buried them.
who took care of the children till they were 20 years old?
Well, again, they were all around. They were with, nobody died less than 60, okay? So people who were 20 years would have had 40 years to train their children. I mean, there certainly would be people around. It's just that in the space of 40 years, that entire generation passed on. But people were being born and people were growing up, and, so the ones who were younger than 20 when the counting took place could be 59 years old, right? So they weren't spring.
I know, but could the children see their parents that died? Where were they buried?
Yes. No. Well, they wouldn't come back and visit them, right? They weren't buried in a place so they could come back and visit. Yes, if that's the question you're asking. Yeah.
No cemetery. There's no cemetery in the
No,
wilderness.
there isn't.
It's,
There isn't.
yeah,
Right.
buried them where they dropped,
Right.
pretty
I'm
much.
sorry,
I'm sure they had a out of the camp place, but yeah.
Right. So I see that Dave. Sorry, I didn't understand your question to begin with, Harlan. David, you have a question.
Yeah, I mean, this whole thing, there's a lot of technical aspects, I guess, or logistical points that we could raise. But I guess my question throughout this whole thing is, what happened to ensure that, basically the next generation that was being raised up wasn't going to commit the same mistake, right? I mean, yes, the generation, that was present was condemned, but there are also the ones now that are around, raising those children.
Right.
And we don't read anywhere that says, okay, how, yes, that they're being punished and they have to, they have to take accountability, but there's nothing explaining how they're going to fix it so that their mistake doesn't carry on. So that's the part I'm most interested in, because, yeah.
Okay. So one, of course, is that they did have Moses and Aaron to try and teach them, right? And we, of course, what basically we learn is that, first of all, they would see what happened. The younger generation, certainly some of them were old enough to see and to understand what was happening and why it was happening. And there was always that possibility then that alone would be a very powerful message to them. But besides that, they also had some very good leaders, and that it's possible that as children they were being trained in more appropriate kinds of ways. Essentially, the way it works out is, if you continue to read the Bible, is that when they had good, strong leaders, they basically were able to toe the line and act responsibly. But we see in the book, especially like in the book of Judges, it's the sad pattern is that they suffer, they learn the lesson, they turn back to God, God protects them, God helps them against the enemies, they have a time of prosperity, and then they're off again. There's a poem, remember there's that poem that Moses tries to teach them before he dies, where it talks about, Yeshurun grew fat and kicked. So the sad commentary is that when we are in a time of prosperity, instead of appreciating that, instead of thinking to ourselves, wow, God is blessing us in such profound kinds of ways, and it's in a sense gives us the incentive to act in a more faithful and loyal and committed kind of way, the reverse tends to take place. And people start to think that they are the reasons for their own prosperity, and don't realize that they are given, right? That we are essentially created in that kind of way. And that's the tragedy. And you almost wind up, well, this is where I'm at these days, which is sad to say, it's like you need adversity, because without adversity, people start to make up new kinds of issues and new kinds of problems that really aren't necessarily such big problems. But it's as if, we need a reason to complain of some kind, if we haven't trained ourselves otherwise. So I realize I've said more than you're asking of me, but hopefully in some ways I'm covering what you're asking me.
No, absolutely. Yeah, you definitely covered it, and your point is well taken. I mean, the comfort level, and which kind of the comfort and prosperity, which then leads to, you can say some level of arrogance if you want to, that winds up, we forget, is an important, is an equally important lesson that plays in here. So, yeah, it all makes sense.
Okay, I'm going to stop the recording here. And thank